Welcome, Commanders. This is Brightwood from Oracle Station, bringing you our crew analysis of Enterprise E. Troi. Enterprise E. Troi was introduced into Star Trek Fleet Command with the release of M61 and the TNG Make It So Part 2 arc in the month of December of 2023. For short, I may reference Enterprise E. Troi as E. Troi, and this is referencing to her group Enterprise E. Enterprise E. Troi is a rare officer in-game. Her division is Science, and her faction is Federation. Her in-game group is going to be, of course, Enterprise E. Most of us know that Deanna Troi is one of the main characters in the science fiction television series Star Trek: The Next Generation. She served as the ship's counselor on the USS Enterprise D and the USS Enterprise E under the command of Jean-Luc Picard. Through most of the series, she held the rank of lieutenant commander. In the 7th season, though, Troi took the bridge officer's examination and was promoted to the rank of commander, but she continued on as counselor. Troi never seemed to have aspirations for command, so it's fitting that Troi's captain's maneuver is chain of command. And this indicates that Troi does not have a captain's maneuver, so equipping Troi in the captain's chair will provide no benefits. Enterprise E's officer ability is Psychoanalysis. This ability reduces the opponent's shield health by a % of the total of officer attack at the beginning of each round versus non-Armada hostiles. This goes up to a healthy 1600% at Commander with a base starting point of 400%. It's important to note on her officer ability that it is limited to hostiles only and will not work on Armadas, PvP, or mission bosses. Her below the deck ability is 3 shots of something, and this increases critical hit damage by a % versus Armadas and hostiles. This base % is 20, and it will go all the way up to 90% at Commander. This makes Troi a rare version of Odo, but she only works against hostiles and Armadas instead of being wide open like Odo. Here it would have been nice to see a better parity between her officer ability and below the deck abilities. But since they are independent of each other, there really is no major impact to her outside of remembering that her officer ability does not work on Armadas or mission bosses, and that her below the deck ability works on just Armadas and hostiles, but not mission bosses. Because Enterprise E. Troi is a rare officer, she only has 2 ATA traits. Those are Doctor and Psionic. This is a high-level review of ATAs, so really understanding the value of Enterprise E. Troi for your ATA needs, you will want to review the ATA she's eligible for and determine their value to you. You can do this with the amazing officer tool put together by Stewie Doo and Loop. The link to the tool is in the Oracle Station's Discord, so come on over and check it out and do some research on Troi's ATAs. So now let's get into Enterprise E. Troi and see if we want to use our ATA trait XP on her. There is more than just a handful of officers with the Doctor's ATA trait, so Troi just increases this list one more for an additional potential officer for this trait. There are 3 ATAs that use the Doctor trait. All of them will adjust their rewards based on your operations level. The first one is Emergency Evacuation. The second is Field Operatives. And the third is Rescue Attempt. All of these are decent ATA offering Federation reputation and credits, crew shards, and speed ups. And based on your status in the game, all of them can be of value to sending crew out on them. But are these enough to warrant us potentially locking our Troi up for at least or up to 2 days? Psionic. Now, this ATA trait is where Enterprise E Troi becomes a little more appealing when it comes to ATA traits. There is only one other officer with the psionic trait, and that is the Epic officer, Gary Mitchell. So, with a limited number of officers with the psionic trait, what are the ATAs that require this trait, and how valuable will they be to us? Well, that ATA mission is Explore Galactic Barrier. This ATA is a very good ATA, and you should try to send crew out on it with the highest critical chance possible. But is Enterprise E Troi the officer for this ATA? Further investigation shows that Gary Mitchell is actually triple traded for this ATA and would get you the highest possible critical rating. Since Gary has been around for a while, hopefully you have unlocked and probably progressed a little bit on him in some trade XP. And because of this, we would not recommend sending E Troi on this ATA. Oracle Station is going to rate Enterprise E Troi's interest in ATAs as a low. We have several other officers that we most likely already invested our trade XPs into for the Doctor's trait, and with Gary Mitchell being triple trait locked on the psionic trait, we really don't see a whole lot of value in investing our hard to earn trait XP on Enterprise E Troi. So now that we've taken a look at Enterprise E's profile, what do we think are her advantages and disadvantages before we go into actual application of her in our crews? First, we'll start out with advantages. She has a decent reduction of shield health, especially at Commander, which is 1600% of attack when you get her maxed. But does this work as well as it looks on paper? Increased critical damage is another advantage, and she's got decent ATA traits. Some disadvantages that stand out right off the bat are she's limited to hostiles only in her officer ability, so she's not going to work on armadas or even your mission bosses. Her officer ability is locked to the attack trait or attack score on your ship, and her below the deck ability is limited to hostiles and armadas. On paper, Enterprise E Troi looks promising. Her reduction of shield health of your target at the beginning of each round appears to be very nice, but it is locked down to a percent of your officer's attack, and that can be limiting, especially at lower ship levels and the level of your Enterprise E Troi herself. Starting at 4%, below the deck looks even more promising though, at least against armadas and hostiles, as she can provide even greater increase to critical damage at max level of Commander than Odo does. Combining her with other officers above and below the deck, though, to include Odo could be very beneficial to your damage output against armadas and hostiles. She has good ATA traits, but we may already have officers that have the Doctor's trait that we've invested in, and Mitchell outshines her in the psionic trait significantly. So now let's get into how we can actually use Enterprise E Troi in our crew setups. So keep in mind that Enterprise E Troi is a PVE officer. Commanders might find benefit in using Troi in an officer's chair on the bridge, and because she is a side chair on the bridge means that we don't really have to worry about synergizing with her for her ability to perform optimally. But commanders will most likely find the initial benefits when using Enterprise E Troi below the deck on hostiles and armadas. Enterprise Troi might take some consideration on how we should drop her in as a replacement for some of your officers in your existing crew builds. We do not want to replace a better performing officer or remove mitigation officers if we don't have compensation below the deck. We will ponder this while we take a look at her more straightforward application, which is below the deck. Putting her below the deck is not as simple as her fellow group member Enterprise E data. It is still much easier to put her below the deck effectively than it is to bridge crew her. So let's start with putting her below the deck in our analysis. Again, it's not that simple as just dropping Enterprise E Troi below the deck and getting her benefits. She specifically increases our critical hit damage by 1%, so we want to make sure that we're going to use her below the deck that we can actually support the critical condition requirement. We can do this several different ways considering the officers we can use to generate critical hits. And being this ability also is only for armadas or hostiles, we need to consider this condition as well when supporting Enterprise E Troi below the deck. We are going to break this down into two separate groups, armadas and then hostiles. Armadas will be the first group that we're going to take a look at what critical chance officers we can use to support Enterprise E Troi in. Now, there are several officers that will increase your critical hit chance, but not all of them are very good. And what I'm going to do here is I'm really just going to touch on the more popular few that we could use to crew our ships against armadas. First off is our long-term running Khan. Khan's been around for a long time. He's got great performance against armadas, and he'll definitely increase our critical hit chances. Along with him, we have newer officer Benjamin Sisko. We also have Chakotay, and then some less popular officers, probably more because of either acquisition or just the way that we need to crew them against armadas. We also have Gorkin and TNG Data. Now, Gorkin is probably more accessible for people, but he's going to be the one that's a little bit harder to crew for your armadas because he needs to sit in the captain's chair. And then TNG Data is a lot harder to acquire. So this is why they're kind of a little bit more on the less popular side, just because acquisition and being able to crew them. Against hostiles, we have a few more choices on how we can increase our critical chances. Our favorite might be Hugh below the deck next to Troi, if you have the crew slots on your ship. On the bridge, we can leverage a few from our armada preferences, and that would be Khan, TNG Data, even Gorkin, and there's also the newly added in the same arc Enterprise E Riker. And finally, there is the even less thought of S&W Ortegas, but she has to be crewed as the captain in your build for her critical chance increase. Once we've met our requirements for Enterprise E Troi, while accounting for our mitigation and ensuring that we have acceptable survivability first and foremost, then we can crew additional officers to increase our damage or even critical damage performance more. Now let's consider how we can leverage Enterprise E Troi on the bridge. Many of you may not have these officers, but my first thought would be to leverage synergy and the Enterprise E group. So considering the officers we have from the Enterprise E group at the time of Troi's release, we have one problem. We can't fully synergize with the released officers. We have 2 command and 2 science officers available. And I find this curious choice, as Data could have probably and maybe should have been an engineering division officer. No matter though, let's see what we can do with the Enterprise E officers and if they will perform well together, or do we need to consider other options? So looking at the Enterprise E group, let's use the following officers on the bridge first. We'll put Enterprise E Picard in our captain's chair, and beside him we'll put Enterprise E Data. And then, of course, since this is Enterprise E Troi's analysis, she is going to take the third seat. This build worked fairly well when grinding some Romulan reputation, focusing on primarily explorers and interceptors. Well, those interceptors were actually scouts, so keep that in mind. Its performance was right up there with my favorite grinding crew of Janeway, the Doctor, and Enterprise E Data. The perk of the setup was the increased reputation gains received, netting me a 15.5% increase in reputation because Enterprise E Picard was on the chair and the synergy he was getting from Data and Troi. Continuing with our Enterprise E group theme, let's swap out Enterprise E Picard for Enterprise E Riker. This build was very similar to our run with E Picard as captain. However, we took several million more damage, mitigating it down to a few 100,000 to the hull. This was an 8.3% increase, but this can be translated to a couple less hostiles per hull when grinding. And with Picard increasing the faction and loot rewards, probably not a better choice to use Enterprise E Riker, even though we were zipping around the system a little bit faster. Now let's try one last Enterprise E group setup, and that will be Enterprise E Picard, E Riker, and E Troi. I didn't expect this to go any better than the last two builds, as we were losing a great officer on the side chair in Enterprise E Data. This, however, still actually performed fairly well. We received the loot increase from Enterprise E Picard, which was very nice, the critical chance increase from Riker, and then, of course, that shield mitigation from Troi. So it actually did work fairly decent, but again, probably not as good as E Picard, Data, and Troi. So okay, enough of the synergy stuff. How about we try a couple of options that might actually make Troi perform a bit better for us? Remember, Troi triggers at the start of each round, so we need to validate if that means that Pike will not provide her a bonus. So let's see what putting her on the bridge with Pike and Morio will do for us. So again, we'll run Pike in the captain's chair, Morio in a side seat, with Enterprise E Troi on the other side chair. The results are interesting here. She performed well, but it doesn't seem like she performed as good as the last three we tried. Rounds with PME Troi went to 1 or 2 versus ending in a single round consistently with some of the other crew. Performance is still overall similar, but I found better success with E Data with Pike and Morio over E Troi. So as you get into your higher level hostiles, swapping Data is going to be better than swapping in E Troi instead of running Chen or Talon. A quick side-by-side comparison of Troi with our Kelvin Pike and Troi without does show, though, she does actually receive a boost from Pike. So this is very good to know when trying to think of what crew we want to run beside or with Enterprise E Troi. And finally, I want to compare if we were place her on one of my favorite grinding setups, and that's going to be Janeway, the Doctor, and Enterprise E Troi. I have to say that I am surprisingly impressed with this build. It performed far better than I expected. It performed as good, if not maybe better, than the builds with Enterprise E Data, or my runs with this setup having Enterprise E Data instead of Troi. And it even ran almost as good as PMD. So this gives me two different options on as far as what I could run for some hostile grinding. Overall, I think Troi is going to be best for us below the deck, where she functions as a hostile and armada version of Odo, increasing the amount of critical damage that we can do, and this is pretty hefty at Commander when it gets to 90%. But on the bridge, she actually does make a good side seat officer, especially if you're going against Triangle or against something that has heavy shield health like Explorers or Surveyors. Overall, I found that Troi did work fairly well, and she wasn't dependent on the combat triangle. Part 2 of the arc didn't reveal to us any way of sourcing Enterprise E Troi in the long run, so we're going to have to pay attention to our events and packs in the store for ways to acquire her officer shards. If after this analysis you're interested in actually acquiring her or leveling her up, because you earned her during the arc or post-arc events or store packs. During the arc, I did find I was able to unlock Enterprise E Troi and get her to tier 2 with no more investment directly towards her shards outside of the battle pass and full event participation. Now that we've actually got to play with Enterprise E Troi and see how we can implement her in our crew builds, what are her final advantages and disadvantages? I think our original list for her advantages is still pretty solid. She has a decent reduction of shield health, especially at Commander with the 1600%, and if we can put strong attack below the deck. Her increase to critical damage when she's below the deck is pretty nice. She has decent ATA traits. She's not triangle specific, but she's going to be better against hostiles with high shield health. And then her disadvantages are fairly accurate in our original assessment as well. So she's still limited to hostiles only for her officer ability. Her officer ability is dependent on the crew's total attack value. Below the deck, she's limited to hostiles and armadas. And she doesn't work on mission bosses. In conclusion, Enterprise E Troi's benefits to us commanders is really going to be subjective to the hostiles we target. A commander's ability to get their attack value high on a ship, and the level of Troi herself, and probably our research and other modifiers, are all going to really play into how well she's going to work for us. She does reduce the amount of shield, much like Yuki does in combat, so there is some value in using Enterprise E Troi. It's really going to require that you go out, crew her, and test her to see if she's more valuable than your other crews on your hostile grinding setups. On the bridge, I did see some value in running her with full synergy with E-Picard and E-Data, which was going to actually help with reputation grinding and loot farming. I did feel like it took a little bit more damage, but ultimately this was offset by the increase in faction reputation and loot that I received from the hostiles. Below the deck, she's an amazing officer. This is really where most commanders are going to find the best value for her. Just keep in mind that you have to set the stage to make sure that she does perform for you, so you're got to generate those critical hits in order for her to increase the amount of critical damage that you're actually putting out. Oracle Station is going to rate Enterprise E Troi as a nice to have. She is nice for the added synergy, sitting in a side seat next to Enterprise E Picard and with E Data, or Enterprise E Picard and E Riker. But she's not necessarily an officer that you will have to be able to progress well into the game. There are plenty of other officers and crew builds that will serve you just as good, if not maybe even better, in most scenarios. Check out our website for more videos. And join us in Discord using the link in the video description to continue the discussion and get access to more resources. We hope you found the video informative and helpful. If so, please give us a thumbs up and share. We look forward to your comments and suggestions. Live long and prosper, Commander. This is Brightwood from Oracle Station, signing off.